When most people today imagine a medieval castle, they picture a storybook fortress rising proudly from a hilltop, turrets piercing the sky, banners fluttering in the wind, and noble knights guarding the gates. It's a vision that comes straight out of fantasy novels and Hollywood films. But the reality of stepping into a real medieval castle for the first time was far more unsettling, even frightening. These structures were built first and foremost for defense and intimidation, not for comfort or beauty. Their design was meant to inspire awe, and sometimes dread, in anyone who approached. The journey often began long before reaching the castle walls. Travelers would approach through muddy roads, winding valleys, or across farmland, and suddenly, the castle would emerge from the landscape like an immovable stone beast. Its towering battlements loomed high above the surrounding village, casting shadows across the fields. From afar, it seemed unshakable, eternal, almost inhuman. For peasants or visitors seeing such a sight for the first time, it was not unlike staring at the very embodiment of power. The lord of the castle didn't even need to speak, the fortress itself did the talking. Crossing the moat was the first real test of nerves. Water filled with refuse, algae, and sometimes even sewage, separated the castle from the world outside. The drawbridge creaked as it lowered, heavy chains groaning with the effort. Walking across it, you'd be fully exposed, guards peering down from the towers, arrows and stones within easy reach if you were unwelcome. This was no warm invitation. You were entering on the Lord's terms, watched, measured, and silently judged. Passing through the gatehouse could feel like stepping into the mouth of a predator. These entrances were deliberately narrow and claustrophobic, forcing guests to move slowly under the constant gaze of defenders. Above, murder holes gaped in the ceiling, ready for boiling water, hot sand, or rocks to be dropped on attackers. For an honored guest, this was simply a demonstration of strength. For an enemy, it was a death trap. Either way, the message was clear: the castle controlled every step you took. Inside the outer bailey, the first impressions of life within the walls often came as a shock. The air was thick with a mix of smells: smoke from hearth fires, manure from horses, refuse from kitchens, and the unmistakable stench of humanity packed tightly together. Medieval sanitation was primitive at best, and castles, despite their grandeur, were not immune to filth. Visitors expecting elegance often found mud, noise, and the bustle of servants, soldiers, and livestock. The architecture itself added to the sense of unease. Cold, damp stone surrounded you on every side. Windows were tiny slits, designed more for archers than for letting in light. Interiors were dim, shadows clinging to every corner. Fireplaces smoked constantly, but their warmth rarely reached far from the hearth. In winter, the chill could be bone-deep, and drafts whistled through gaps in the walls and shutters. A castle might have looked like paradise from the outside, but stepping within, it felt more like a cave carved by human ambition. Sound carried differently here too. Boots echoed against stone floors. Metal clattered as guards shifted their armor. Voices reverberated strangely in the great halls, sometimes booming, sometimes muffled. For someone accustomed to the open air of a village or farm, the acoustics of the castle could feel overwhelming, even unnatural. Every clang of steel reminded you of the military presence that defined these places. And yet, despite the gloom, there was a strange magnificence in the details. Colorful tapestries lined the walls of the lord's halls, not only to display wealth but also to block drafts. Heraldic banners reminded everyone of family honor and noble lineage. In the chapel, flickering candlelight reflected off gilded icons, creating an atmosphere of awe. These flashes of beauty stood in stark contrast to the harsher realities of daily life, reinforcing the castle's dual identity, both fortress and residence, both prison and palace. For those arriving as servants or lower-ranking workers, the first impression was one of sheer scale. The kitchens, stables, and storerooms formed a world of endless labor. The clatter of pots, the shouting of orders, the stamping of horses, it all created a sense of ceaseless motion. The castle wasn't just a home, it was a machine, powered by human effort. Every corner demanded hands to clean, fires to stoke, and defenses to maintain. To step inside as a servant was to be swallowed by an unending cycle of toil. For nobles or foreign guests, however, the first impression was also one of surveillance. Castles were political centers, filled with rivals, spies, and ambitious courtiers. Walking into the great hall, you were immediately judged by your attire, your gestures, even the way you bowed. Eyes followed you everywhere, and gossip spread quickly. Behind the cold stone walls, human drama simmered constantly, and alliances shifted like the smoke curling from the hearth. Children, too, experienced the castle in their own unique way. For noble children raised inside, the castle was both playground and prison. Its towers offered dizzying heights for adventure, but its thick walls kept them sealed away from the outside world. For peasant children brought in as servants or apprentices, the sheer size and harsh discipline of the castle could be terrifying. They were often struck by how little freedom they had compared to their village homes. Above all, what struck most newcomers was the sense of hierarchy embedded in the very walls. Every space had meaning. The Lord's chambers stood high above, both literally and symbolically. The great hall was the stage for authority and ceremony. Servants were tucked into cramped quarters, sometimes with straw mats for beds. Guards patrolled constantly, their presence a reminder that violence was never far away. The architecture itself reinforced order, who belonged where, who held power, and who existed only to serve. To modern eyes, castles may seem romantic. They are the stuff of fairy tales, wedding photos, and tourist brochures. But to the people who first walked through their gates in the Middle Ages, the overwhelming first impression was not romance. It was power. Cold, unyielding, stone-built power. The castle was not designed to welcome you, it was designed to control you, to protect those within, and to remind everyone outside who ruled this patch of earth. And as we move deeper into this world, we'll see that the true life inside a medieval castle was not only about stone walls and soaring towers, it was about the people who lived within them. From the lords and ladies at the top to the servants and peasants at the bottom, the castle was a living organism, and every person who crossed its threshold became part of its story. To truly understand life inside a medieval castle, we need to climb higher than the drafty kitchens and muddy courtyards, up into the chambers of power. Because while the stone walls projected strength to the outside world, what really sustained the castle's dominance was the rigid hierarchy within, an invisible ladder of privilege and duty, headed by the lord and lady of the estate. The lord was not merely the owner of the castle. He was its heartbeat, its judge, and its symbol of authority. His word was law within those walls, and often across the lands beyond them. To peasants, he was the figure whose decisions determined whether they could marry, farm certain fields, or even survive a famine. To knights and soldiers, he was commander and paymaster. To his family, he was both protector and master. Every stone of the castle was ultimately tied to his name and his reputation. But being a lord was no easy privilege. He bore responsibilities that were as exhausting as they were dangerous. At any moment, disputes between neighbors, uprisings from peasants, or threats from rival nobles could demand swift action. The lord was expected to maintain not only military readiness but also economic stability. He needed to ensure the fields produced, taxes were collected, justice was dispensed, and the castle remained a formidable fortress. His life was less about leisurely feasts and more about endless duties. Daily routine for a lord often began with petitions. Subjects, knights, merchants, and even priests would line up to plead their cases. Disputes over land boundaries, unpaid debts, accusations of theft, these matters came to the lord's attention, and he was expected to render judgment. In many ways, he functioned as both a landlord and a judge, making decisions that could change lives in an instant. Justice in a castle was swift and rarely merciful, a reflection of the lord's authority and the harsh realities of the age. While the lord wielded power in public, much of the castle's internal management fell to the lady. Too often, history has painted medieval noblewomen as passive figures, but inside the castle, the lady's role was vital. She was the overseer of the household, responsible for ensuring that servants worked efficiently, storerooms were stocked, and meals were prepared for dozens or even hundreds of mouths. Her authority reached into every chamber, from the buttery to the great hall. When the lord was absent, which was often, due to wars, hunts, or political travel, the lady effectively became the ruler of the castle. She might oversee finances, negotiate with tenants, or even organize the defense of the fortress. There are recorded cases of noblewomen personally commanding garrisons during sieges, proving that behind the curtains of medieval hierarchy, female power was real and significant. Yet this authority came at a cost: immense pressure, constant scrutiny, and the knowledge that any misstep could damage the family standing. Marriage, for both lords and ladies, was rarely about love. It was about power. Castles themselves were often symbols of dynastic unions, built or expanded to seal alliances between families. A noble marriage might secure peace between rivals, gain new lands, or strengthen claims to titles. The individuals at the center of such arrangements had little choice. Children as young as 12 or 13 could find themselves bound in matrimony, their futures decided by strategies of inheritance and politics. Behind these alliances, however, life in the upper chambers of the castle could be lonely. For a lady married into a foreign household, isolation was common. Surrounded by unfamiliar servants, cut off from childhood friends, she often relied heavily on personal maids or confessors for companionship. For the lord, the weight of political ambition left little room for domestic affection. While romance existed, sometimes in secret, it was often overshadowed by duty. The hierarchy inside the castle extended beyond the ruling family. The great hall was a stage where status was displayed with precision. The lord sat at the high table, elevated above everyone else, while retainers, knights, and guests were placed in descending order of importance. Even the arrangement of dishes and the serving of food reflected one's rank. A visitor's position at the table could be both an honor and a message, friendship, alliance, or humiliation made visible for all to see. Yet, beneath this outward display of harmony, the castle was riddled with intrigue. Courtiers whispered, knights schemed for favor, and rivals waited for any sign of weakness. A careless word in the wrong ear could spark a feud. A misjudged decision could cost loyalty. Even within the family, tensions brewed, brothers fought over inheritance, daughters resisted arranged marriages, and lords feared betrayal from within their own bloodline. The higher you climbed in the hierarchy, the more perilous your position became. For those at the bottom, however, the lord and lady appeared untouchable. Their chambers, often placed in the upper stories of the keep, were like sanctuaries above the daily grind. Rich fabrics adorned their beds, carved chests held treasures, and private chapels allowed for solitary prayer. Compared to the straw pallets of servants, these luxuries seemed otherworldly. Yet even here, comfort was relative. Rooms were still cold, candles were scarce, and privacy was almost non-existent. The real power of the lord and lady wasn't measured in silks or jewels but in control, over people, over resources, and over the rhythms of life itself. Their authority determined when the castle feasted, when it fought, and when it prayed. Every inhabitant, from the youngest kitchen boy to the oldest knight, moved in orbit around their will. The castle may have been made of stone, but its living order was shaped by human ambition, fear, and loyalty. In the end, stepping into the chambers of the ruling family revealed the central truth of medieval hierarchy: castles were not only fortresses of stone but fortresses of power. Every wall, every hall, every chamber reinforced who ruled and who obeyed. To live inside a castle was to live inside a pyramid of authority, with the lord and lady at its pinnacle, bearing both the privilege and the crushing weight of their position. And just beneath them, ready to serve, to fight, and to uphold the code of loyalty, stood the knights and soldiers, the enforcers of the castle's order. When people today hear the word knight, they often picture a glittering hero from legend, rescuing damsels, dueling dragons, and upholding chivalry with shining armor. But the truth of what knights and soldiers really did inside a medieval castle was far more complicated, and often far darker. Behind the polished myth lay the reality of men who were warriors, enforcers, and sometimes ruthless killers. The knight was, at his core, a professional fighter. His life revolved around war, training for war, or preparing others for war. From a young age, boys destined for knighthood were sent away from their families to serve as pages in another noble household. At first, their duties were menial, carrying messages, cleaning armor, tending horses. But all of it was designed to instill discipline, loyalty, and the beginnings of martial skill. By adolescence, they rose to the rank of squire, serving a knight directly. This meant long days of maintaining armor, sharpening weapons, and standing at the edge of tournaments, waiting to rush in if their master was unhorsed. It was here that they learned not only the arts of combat but also the strict social codes that governed knightly life. A squire who proved himself brave, loyal, and skilled could eventually earn the ceremonial dubbing that transformed him into a knight. Inside the castle, knights were more than just warriors. They were the visible arm of the lord's authority. They patrolled the walls, enforced the lord's justice, and kept order among the garrison. To servants and peasants, knights were intimidating figures in mail or plate, reminders of the power they served. For all the talk of honor, knights could be brutal. They were expected to crush revolts, intimidate rivals, and, if needed, spill blood without hesitation. Their loyalty was pledged not to lofty ideals, but to their lord. Daily life for a knight was filled with routine discipline. Training was constant, practicing with sword, lance, and bow, drilling in formation, and riding endlessly to perfect horsemanship. A knight's armor alone required practice to master. Chainmail weighed dozens of pounds, while later plate armor demanded strength and endurance to fight ineffectively. Despite popular belief, knights were not clumsy in armor, but moving, fighting, and surviving in it took relentless conditioning. Tournaments provided a rare chance to display skill publicly. But these events, often romanticized today, were violent affairs. Jousts could leave men with shattered bones, crushed chests, or even dead on the field. Melee battles were even more chaotic, mass skirmishes that resembled real warfare, fought not only for glory but for ransom. Capturing an enemy knight could mean profit, since noble families were expected to pay dearly to win back their kin. Tournaments were part sport, part training, part deadly gamble. Beneath the knights stood the common soldiers, the footmen, archers, and guards who formed the backbone of the castle's defense. These men lacked the glamour of knighthood but bore much of the burden of daily military labor. They guarded the walls through freezing nights, drilled with spears and crossbows, and manned the gates against intruders. Life as a soldier in a castle was harsh and monotonous, endless watch shifts, poor rations, and constant readiness for a conflict that might never come. The relationship between knights and soldiers was uneasy. Knights saw themselves as a superior warrior class, bound by noble lineage and training. Soldiers were often hired men, sometimes mercenaries, sometimes peasants pressed into service. Yet in times of siege or battle, both stood shoulder to shoulder, sharing the same dangers. A boiling cauldron of pitch or a hail of arrows did not distinguish between noble knight and common footman. The famous code of chivalry that people associate with knights was less about romance and more about control. It encouraged loyalty to one's lord, defense of the faith, and protection of the weak, but in practice, these ideals were flexible. Knights could be ruthless in war, plundering villages, killing peasants, or breaking oaths if it suited their interests. Chronicles are filled with examples of knights abandoning lofty codes for political gain or sheer survival. Chivalry was as much a public performance as it was a way of life. Religion also played a role in shaping the knightly identity. Many knights saw themselves as soldiers of God, especially during the Crusades. In castles, chaplains reminded them that their duty was not only to their lord but to their faith. Confession, Prayer before battle, and donations to the church helped knights reconcile the violence of their profession with the demands of Christian morality. Whether this eased their consciences is another matter entirely. For all their discipline, knights lived in a world of constant tension. Rivalries between lords could pull them into sudden wars. Shifting allegiances meant today's ally could be tomorrow's enemy. Even within the castle walls, knights competed fiercely for favor, land, or marriage prospects. A careless insult at a feast might end in a duel. Honor was fragile, and reputation could make or break a knight's fortunes. But perhaps the most important role knights played inside a castle was psychological. Their presence projected power. A guest arriving at a castle and seeing armored men drilling in the courtyard knew instantly that violence was always an option. For servants and peasants, knights symbolized the lord's ability to enforce obedience. For enemies, they were a deterrent, the human embodiment of the fortress's strength. The castle was not only a structure of stone but also of steel, discipline, and intimidation, and knights were the ones who made that reality visible. Still, behind the glint of armor and the thunder of hooves, knights were human. They ate, drank, quarreled, and laughed like anyone else. They suffered from wounds that never fully healed, endured crushing fatigue from campaigns, and carried the trauma of brutal battles. Many knights did not live to old age, cut down in war or disease before reaching their prime. The myth of the invincible knight was powerful, but the truth was that life as a warrior was short, dangerous, and fraught with uncertainty. In the end, the castle's strength depended not just on walls of stone, but on the men who defended it. Knights and soldiers alike formed the living shield of their lord's power, the enforcers of justice, and the guardians of order. Without them, the grand halls and towering keeps would have been little more than empty shells. And yet, for all their importance, knights and soldiers were not the ones who kept the castle alive day after day. That burden fell on a very different group of people, the servants and peasants whose endless labor made life within the fortress even possible. If the lord, lady, knights, and soldiers formed the visible face of a medieval castle, its invisible strength, the true engine that kept the fortress alive, was the labor of servants and peasants. Their work rarely makes it into the romantic legends, but without them, the castle would have collapsed into chaos. For every glittering banquet in the great hall, there were dozens of hands preparing, cleaning, and hauling. For every battle fought at the gates, there were peasants who had carried stones, cut timber, or cooked meals that made survival possible. Entering the world of a servant inside a medieval castle was to enter a cycle of ceaseless toil. The hierarchy of service was as strict as that of nobility. At the very top were senior officials, stewards, bailiffs, and chamberlains, trusted men who managed accounts, distributed supplies, and oversaw discipline. Below them, countless household servants filled specialized roles: cooks, scullions, grooms, laundresses, maids, falconers, stable boys, and more. Each had a task, and each knew their place. The castle kitchen was perhaps the busiest and noisiest place of all. Fires roared in massive hearths, spits turned endlessly with roasting meats, and the clang of pots echoed off the stone. At the lowest rung of this world was the spit boy, often just a child, who spent hours slowly turning a roasting rod by hand, sweat and smoke stinging his eyes. Above him, cooks orchestrated meals for dozens, sometimes hundreds, depending on the size of the household. They not only prepared food but also managed storage, monitored supplies, and improvised when shortages arose. Mistakes could mean the wrath of both the lord and the hungry garrison. Elsewhere, maids scrubbed floors covered with rushes, a mixture of straw and herbs meant to mask the stench of daily life. These rushes quickly absorbed grease, spilled ale, and worse, and they had to be replaced frequently. Servants also tended to fires, carried water from wells, laundered clothes in icy streams, and cleaned chamber pots from noble chambers. It was grueling work, often thankless, but it kept the illusion of order intact. The stable yard was another hub of constant motion. Horses were the engines of medieval power, essential for knights, hunting, travel, and war. Grooms and stable boys fed, brushed, and mucked stalls, often rising before dawn. A knight's horse was as valuable as any piece of armor, and neglecting it could bring severe punishment. Servants who cared for these animals bore responsibility far beyond their station. Life for peasants connected to the castle was equally demanding. Many were not permanent residents but were summoned when needed, especially during building projects, harvest times, or when war threatened. The construction of a castle itself was often carried out by peasant labor, whether hauling limestone blocks, cutting timber for scaffolding, or digging moats. These men and women worked long hours for little reward, driven by obligation to their lord's authority. For peasants drawn into castle service during festivals or military campaigns, the experience was overwhelming. Inside the walls, they faced strict discipline and alien routines. They might be assigned to haul barrels of ale, serve trenchers of food during feasts, or repair defenses. Many of them had never before encountered the noise, hierarchy, and constant surveillance of castle life. Returning home, they often carried stories of awe mixed with exhaustion. The contrast between noble luxury and servant hardship was starkest during banquets. While the lord, lady, and honored guests sat at the high table enjoying roasted swan, spiced wine, and elaborate pies, the servants darted about carrying trays, refilling cups, and cleaning spills. Few ever tasted the delicacies they prepared. Their meals were simpler: bread, pottage, ale, sometimes scraps from the feast if fortune allowed. The gap between upstairs and downstairs was not only visible but edible. And yet, servants were not simply invisible tools. They were the eyes and ears of the castle. A maid cleaning chambers overheard conversations. A steward controlling the storerooms knew exactly how much wealth passed through the gates. A falconer entrusted with the lord's prized birds could wield surprising influence. Servants walked in the shadows, but their presence was everywhere. Some used that presence to their advantage, trading information or currying favor in subtle ways. The risks of service were many. Accidents with fire, heavy loads, or animals were common. Disease spread quickly in crowded quarters. Punishments for mistakes could be severe, ranging from beatings to dismissal. Yet, service also offered opportunity. A clever or loyal servant might rise in station, entrusted with greater responsibilities. Some even gained enough favor to secure small plots of land or marriage into better circumstances. For children born into servant families, the castle was their world. They learned tasks from a young age: fetching water, sweeping floors, carrying messages. Childhood as we understand it today hardly existed. They were expected to work as soon as they could walk steadily and speak clearly. Their games, when they had time, were shaped by the castle itself: mock sword fights in the courtyards, hide-and-seek among barrels in the storeroom. To the noble family, servants and peasants were often invisible until something went wrong. A feast delayed, a horse neglected, a chamber pot forgotten, only then did the lords notice, and often with harsh words. But to one another, servants formed their own community. In shared quarters, over shared meals, they forged friendships, whispered complaints, and told stories. They lived in the shadows of power, but they carried their own small joys and sorrows. Ultimately, the castle was a stage, and every grand performance of power, every feast, every council, every display of wealth, relied on the unseen labor behind the curtain. Lords and ladies could not have ruled without knights, and knights could not have fought without food, clothing, and equipment prepared by countless hands. The peasants in the fields and the servants in the halls were the true backbone of castle life. For them, the castle was not a symbol of romance or grandeur. It was a workplace, a master's house, sometimes even a prison of duty. They endured long hours, harsh treatment, and constant demands, not because they chose it, but because the hierarchy of their world left them little choice. And still, day after day, they kept the fires burning, the horses fed, the walls repaired, and the castle alive. As we move from the labor of servants into the grand spectacles of the castle, we see another side of medieval life: the dazzling feasts that proclaimed wealth and power. But behind every banquet's glittering facade was sweat, smoke, and endless toil. If the heart of a medieval castle was its great hall, then its stomach was the kitchen. And like any stomach, it was never still. From dawn until deep into the night, smoke curled from the kitchen chimneys, pots boiled over roaring fires, and servants scurried through stone corridors carrying trays of food, jugs of ale, and baskets of bread. To keep a castle alive was to keep it fed, and the kitchen was the engine that powered this daily ritual of survival and spectacle. The scale of castle kitchens was enormous. Feeding a household of dozens, sometimes hundreds, was no small task. A single feast for visiting nobles might demand whole herds of livestock, dozens of barrels of ale, and carts full of bread. Even on ordinary days, the kitchen had to prepare meals for the lord and lady, their family, the knights and soldiers stationed in the castle, and the countless servants who labored behind the scenes. The smell of roasting meat and simmering stews was constant, but so was the sweat and exhaustion of those who made it possible. At the lowest rung were the kitchen boys, children assigned to fetch water, carry firewood, or turn the spits where whole animals roasted. It was dangerous work. Flames, sharp knives, and boiling cauldrons meant that burns and cuts were common. Above them, scullions scrubbed greasy pots until their hands cracked and bled. Slightly higher in rank were bakers, brewers, and butchers, each working in separate quarters to keep supplies moving. At the top stood the master cook, a figure of both skill and authority, responsible for planning meals, managing stores, and ensuring that the lord's table reflected his wealth and power. The logistics were staggering. Bread was the cornerstone of every meal, baked in vast ovens that required constant stoking. Beer and ale were brewed daily, since water was often unsafe to drink. Meat had to be salted, smoked, or dried to keep it edible, while spices, imported at great cost, were measured carefully, for they were both flavor and status symbol. Pepper, cinnamon, and saffron were more than seasonings. They were a declaration that this was no ordinary household but a seat of prestige. All of this effort reached its climax in the Great Hall, where meals became performances of power. The hall was more than a dining room, it was the stage on which the lord displayed his wealth, authority, and hospitality. Long wooden tables were laid out, covered with trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread that served as edible plates. Candles flickered in iron chandeliers overhead, tapestries muted the echo of stone walls, and heraldic banners reminded guests of the lineage and honor of their host. When the feast began, it was a spectacle for the senses. Minstrels played lutes and harps, jesters performed tricks, and the smell of roasted boar or venison filled the hall. Servants hurried in lines, balancing platters of roasted swans adorned with their feathers, pies filled with spiced fruits, and steaming cauldrons of stew. Ale and wine flowed freely, poured into goblets that clinked as guests toasted their host. To be invited to such a feast was to be reminded of where true power resided. But beneath the pageantry lay harsher truths. Food hygiene was often poor, and spoiled meat was sometimes masked with heavy spices. Medical accounts suggest that food poisoning was not uncommon. Rats and insects could infest storerooms, and servants handling food rarely had the means to stay clean. For the nobles at the high table, meals were indulgent and excessive, but for the workers in the kitchens, they were grueling marathons of heat, smoke, and pressure. Even the very structure of the meal reflected hierarchy. Nobles and honored guests ate the finest cuts, delicately spiced dishes, and exotic fruits. Lower-ranking retainers were served simpler fare, often boiled meats or pottages. Servants at the bottom rarely ate during the feast itself. Instead, they might be given leftovers afterward, sometimes the trenchers themselves soaked with gravy and grease. Food reinforced social order just as surely as armor or titles. Feasts were not merely for pleasure, they were tools of politics. Hosting a lavish banquet impressed allies, intimidated rivals, and displayed a lord's ability to command resources. During times of peace, feasts cemented bonds of loyalty. During times of tension, they were subtle warnings: look how much wealth we command, look how many retainers gather under our roof. The castle kitchen, in that sense, was as important to diplomacy as the armory. For the servants, however, the memory of a feast was not music or laughter but exhaustion. After hours of preparation, they spent the night scrubbing dishes, sweeping rushes soaked in spilled wine, and carting out the remains of the feast. Bones were thrown to dogs, trenchers distributed to the poor, and the hall restored to order for the next day's business. Few of the people who made the feast possible ever enjoyed its pleasures. Yet the feasting hall, for all its excess, was also a rare space of unity. In those moments, the castle's diverse inhabitants, from nobles to knights, clerks to cooks, were bound together in the shared ritual of eating. Even though hierarchy dictated who sat where and who ate what, the act itself reinforced the idea of the castle as a living community, each part essential to the whole. To modern eyes, the feasts of medieval castles may seem extravagant, bizarre, even grotesque. But to those who lived within these walls, they were essential. They fed bodies, yes, but they also fed reputations. A castle that could not host lavish meals was a castle whose power was in question. And as the last candles burned low and the hall returned to shadow, the echo of feasting gave way to another reality of castle life, one less glamorous, more dangerous, and often far more unpleasant. Beyond the smell of roasted meats lingered another, less pleasant odor, the realities of medieval health and hygiene. If the feasting hall dazzled with its spectacle of abundance, the latrines and sickrooms of a castle reminded everyone of the stark reality of medieval life. Behind the banners, beneath the stone walls, lurked an enemy more dangerous than any invading army, disease. And within the cramped spaces of a castle, it thrived. Contrary to modern romantic notions, medieval castles were not pristine palaces of chivalry and refinement. They were crowded, smoky, and often foul-smelling places where hygiene was a daily battle, and one often lost. The same walls that protected inhabitants from outside threats also trapped filth, odors, and germs inside. Imagine a fortress filled with dozens, sometimes hundreds of people, nobles, knights, cooks, servants, stable boys, and prisoners, all living in close quarters, sharing limited facilities, and relying on rudimentary sanitation. One of the most pressing concerns was waste disposal. Castles were equipped with garderobes, stone or wooden latrine chambers built along outer walls or over moats. These openings channeled human waste downward into cesspits or running water. From the outside, a garderobe might look like a small stone balcony protruding from the wall, but inside it was simply a bench with a hole. While functional, garderobes were hardly sanitary. Cesspits overflowed, and the stench could be unbearable. Worse still, they created structural vulnerabilities. Attackers sometimes used the shafts as entry points, and in times of siege, when waste disposal was limited, disease could spread rapidly. Bathing was equally complicated. Contrary to the myth that medieval people never bathed, many did, but not with the frequency or ease we expect today. Nobles might bathe in wooden tubs filled with heated water, scented with herbs like rosemary or lavender to mask unpleasant odors. Bathhouses existed in towns, but inside castles, bathing was sporadic, often reserved for special occasions. For ordinary servants, a quick rinse in cold water was sometimes the best they could manage. Daily cleanliness, in the modern sense, was unattainable. Hygiene wasn't just about bathing, it was about the environment. Castles were filled with smoke from open hearths and kitchens, which blackened walls and lungs alike. Animals were stabled within or just outside the walls, bringing with them fleas, lice, and manure. Rushes laid on floors to soften steps and absorb spills quickly became soaked with grease, food scraps, and vermin. A castle might look magnificent from afar, but step inside and you were assaulted by the smell of sweat, smoke, refuse, and damp stone. The lack of sanitation set the stage for disease, and when illness struck, the consequences were often catastrophic. The most infamous example was the Black Death of the 14th century, which swept across Europe with devastating speed. Castles, like villages and towns, were not spared. Rats and fleas carried plague into every corner of medieval society, and even the thickest castle walls offered no protection. In overcrowded conditions, the disease spread with ruthless efficiency. But plague was only one of many threats. Dysentery, known at the time as the bloody flux, was common, fueled by contaminated water and poor waste disposal. Tuberculosis, leprosy, and fevers of unknown origin haunted castle residents. Wounds from battle or daily labor often became infected, and with no concept of germ theory, even a small cut could prove fatal. Medical treatment was a mixture of practical remedies, religious rituals, and superstition. The castle's resident physician or barber surgeon relied on the ancient theories of humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, believing that illness came from imbalances. Treatments included bloodletting, purges, and herbal concoctions. Sometimes these remedies offered relief, often they did more harm than good. A sick noble might receive care in a chamber warmed by tapestries and attended by priests offering prayers. A sick servant, by contrast, was often left to endure illness with little more than basic herbs or the hope of survival. The fear of disease also shaped daily life in castles. Amulets, charms, and prayers were used as protection. Incense and strong-smelling herbs were burned to purify the air. During outbreaks, some castles closed their gates entirely, isolating themselves in an attempt to keep contagion out. Yet even isolation was not foolproof. Disease could arrive with a traveling merchant, a soldier returning from campaign, or even a beloved pet. Hygiene challenges also affected morale and discipline. Knights and soldiers confined within castle walls during sieges suffered from cramped quarters, spoiled food, and contaminated water. Accounts describe outbreaks of illness that decimated garrisons before enemy armies even breached the walls. For all their strength and fortification, castles could crumble from within under the invisible assault of disease. The psychological toll was immense. Death was a constant companion in the Middle Ages, and nowhere was this more visible than in the confined quarters of a castle. Families mourned children lost to fevers, servants quietly disappeared after succumbing to infection, and even lords and ladies faced the terrifying reality that no wealth or power could guarantee health. The sight of processions carrying bodies to burial grounds was a grim reminder that mortality lurked behind even the grandest stone walls. Yet, for all the horrors, people adapted. Servants learned to keep rushes fresher by replacing them with aromatic herbs. Water was boiled or flavored with wine to make it safer to drink. Herbal knowledge grew, and over generations, certain plants like garlic, sage, and thyme became trusted allies against sickness. And though primitive by today's standards, these measures offered a degree of resilience. When we picture the splendor of medieval banquets or the grandeur of armored knights, it is easy to forget this side of castle life. But to truly understand what it meant to live inside a medieval fortress, we must confront the reality that every day was shadowed by filth, foul air, and the lurking presence of disease. Life inside a castle was not just about power and pageantry, it was also about endurance in the face of discomfort and danger. And as we leave behind the dim corridors of garderobes and sickrooms, the story of castle life leads us to another defining aspect of survival, the daily rhythms of work and duty. For while disease haunted the castle, life had to go on. Knights trained, servants labored, and routines defined the heartbeat of the fortress. Behind the high stone walls, daily life in a medieval castle was a blend of discipline, duty, and routine. While visitors might have been dazzled by feasts and tournaments, the true reality of castle living was not constant excitement, it was work. From sunrise to sunset, every inhabitant, from the lowliest scullion to the lord himself, had a role to play in keeping the fortress alive and functioning. Castles were not museums of stillness, they were living, breathing machines of medieval society, and their rhythm was set by labor. The day began early. As the first light of dawn crept through narrow arrow slits, servants were already awake. The steward, one of the most important officers in the castle, oversaw the day's operations. He was responsible for managing supplies, organizing the workforce, and ensuring that every task, from preparing meals to maintaining defenses, was carried out. Under him, a hierarchy of servants and officials handled specific duties. The chamberlain cared for the lord's private quarters, the constable supervised the garrison of soldiers, and the marshal oversaw horses and stables. Every role mattered. For the majority of castle residents, work was physical and relentless. Kitchen servants stoked fires, kneaded bread, and hauled water from wells or nearby rivers. Stable boys mucked out stalls, brushed horses, and repaired tack. Laundry workers boiled clothes in huge cauldrons, scrubbing until their hands were raw. The smith hammered metal into tools, nails, or weapons, while carpenters repaired furniture, wagons, and the castle's wooden defenses. Even young children had chores, running errands, carrying messages, or tending to livestock. Life in a castle was not a life of leisure for most, it was a life of constant service. Knights and men-at-arms had their own routines. Contrary to romantic depictions of knights endlessly charging into battle, much of their time was spent training and maintaining readiness. The castle yard rang with the clash of wooden practice swords, the thud of lances against shields, and the barking commands of instructors. Squires, young men in training to become knights, polished armor, cared for horses, and absorbed lessons in discipline, etiquette, and strategy. These drills were not only preparation for war, they were daily reminders that a castle was first and foremost a military stronghold. For the lord and lady of the castle, daily life involved both governance and symbolism. The lord held court, listening to petitions from peasants, settling disputes among tenants, and managing the estate's finances. He was expected to be both warrior and administrator, ready to defend his lands yet also capable of running them effectively. The lady, meanwhile, had significant responsibilities of her own. She supervised domestic affairs, managed servants, oversaw food stores, and ensured that the household ran smoothly in her husband's absence. In times of war, some ladies even took command of the castle's defense, proving themselves formidable leaders. Religious observance was woven into the rhythm of each day. Many castles had private chapels where residents gathered for morning prayers, masses, and evening devotions. Monks or priests served as spiritual guides, while the ringing of bells marked the hours. Faith shaped not only the daily schedule but also the moral framework of castle life, reminding all who lived there that their worldly duties were tied to a higher order. Beyond religious devotion, leisure and entertainment punctuated the workday, though such moments were unevenly distributed. Nobles enjoyed music, poetry, and hunting expeditions in the surrounding forests. Falconry, a favored pastime, required immense patience and skill, symbolizing both status and refinement. For the lower ranks, leisure was rarer and simpler, a shared story by the fire, a game of dice, or a stolen hour of rest after long labor. Even laughter and play carried weight, for they provided relief in a life otherwise dominated by duty. Life in a castle was also deeply seasonal. In summer, days stretched long, filled with agricultural tasks, construction, and outdoor training. In winter, life contracted inward. Fires roared in the great hall, work slowed, and supplies were rationed carefully. Cold seeped through the stone walls, making warmth and food more precious than ever. Servants patched clothing, soldiers sharpened weapons, and nobles passed the time with games, reading, or religious study. The wheel of the year dictated the rhythm of the castle as surely as any clock. At the heart of this daily life was hierarchy. Social rank determined not only duties but also living conditions. Nobles slept in private chambers hung with tapestries, warmed by braziers, and furnished with beds of wool or feather. Servants, by contrast, often slept in shared quarters, sometimes on straw pallets near the kitchens or stables. Meals were similarly stratified, the lord dined on delicacies in the great hall, while servants ate simpler fare at separate tables or after their masters had finished. Every corner of the castle reinforced these divisions, ensuring that order was maintained. Yet despite these differences, the castle functioned as a community. Each person's work, no matter how humble, contributed to the survival of the whole. The mason who repaired a crumbling wall, the cook who prepared a soldier's stew, the boy who fetched water for the kitchens, all were part of the same living organism. A castle could not endure without the combined efforts of every individual inside. It is easy to imagine medieval castles only as stages for dramatic battles, sieges, and political intrigues. But those moments of high drama were rare compared to the daily grind of work and duty. For the people who actually lived there, life was not a fairy tale, it was a cycle of labor, devotion, hierarchy, and resilience. And that cycle created the foundation upon which the legends of castles were built. As the sun set and the day's work ended, torches flickered in corridors, and the castle prepared for night. Servants collapsed into exhausted sleep, guards took up positions on the walls, and the lord and lady retreated to their chambers. Tomorrow would bring the same rhythm of toil and responsibility, the same demands of survival within stone walls. But the story of castle life is not complete without looking beyond its gates. For castles were not isolated worlds unto themselves, they were the centers of vast estates, drawing in the labor and loyalty of peasants in the surrounding countryside. To understand the true power of a castle, we must leave the inner courtyard and step into the sprawling lands beyond, where villagers toiled under the shadow of the fortress. A medieval castle was never an isolated island of stone. Its true power extended far beyond its walls, stretching into the fields, farms, and villages that surrounded it. To understand what life was really like inside a castle, we must also look outward, because the rhythms of castle life were inseparably tied to the land and the people who worked it. Without the surrounding economy, the castle could not survive. At the heart of this relationship was the feudal system. The lord of the castle was not merely a military commander, he was also a landlord, overseeing vast estates populated by peasants and serfs. These villagers, bound by duty and tradition, worked the fields in exchange for protection. Their labor provided the grain, vegetables, livestock, and taxes that sustained the castle's inhabitants. It was a system built on obligation, the peasant gave his sweat, the lord gave his shield. Each village nestled near a castle functioned as a hive of activity. Thatched roof cottages dotted the landscape, their smoke curling into the sky. Fields of barley, oats, and wheat stretched outward, divided by hedgerows and dirt tracks. Livestock grazed in common pastures, sheep for wool, cows for milk, and pigs for meat. For villagers, the cycle of the seasons was everything. Spring meant planting, summer brought harvest labor, autumn required storing grain and preserving food, and winter was a time of scarcity, when survival depended on what had been laid by. The castle was both benefactor and burden. On one hand, it provided security. When raiders swept through the countryside or rival lords threatened violence, peasants could flee behind its walls, seeking refuge within the fortress. On the other hand, the castle demanded much in return. Taxes were levied in kind, a portion of harvested grain, a number of chickens, or a share of wool. Labor, too, was often required. Villagers might be called upon to repair castle walls, transport goods, or provide manpower during times of war. The castle's strength came directly from the backs of those who lived in its shadow. Markets and trade bound castle and village together. Weekly markets sprang up at the castle gates, where peasants sold surplus produce and craftsmen offered goods. Blacksmiths displayed tools and horseshoes, potters sold sturdy earthenware, and weavers brought lengths of cloth. Traveling merchants added spice to the scene, bringing salt, wine, or rare fabrics from distant lands. These markets were not only economic hubs but also social ones. News, gossip, and stories flowed as freely as the ale. In many ways, the market square was as vital to medieval life as the great hall was inside the castle. The economy of a castle was not just about survival, it was about status. A wealthy lord demonstrated his power through the prosperity of his lands. Well-fed soldiers, stocked granaries, and flourishing villages were outward signs of strength. Conversely, neglected lands or overburdened peasants spelled weakness, and rival lords would notice. The castle's treasury depended on rents, taxes, and tolls, which in turn fueled its ability to host feasts, fund armies, and build fortifications. Every stone added to a castle wall was, ultimately, paid for by the labor of villagers. For peasants, life was harsh. Most were serfs, legally bound to the land they worked. They could not leave without the lord's permission and owed him a portion of nearly everything they produced. Their days were filled with backbreaking toil, plowing, sowing, reaping, gathering firewood, tending animals. Children worked alongside parents from an early age, while women not only labored in the fields but also managed households, cooked, spun wool, and raised children. Illness, poor harvests, or harsh winters could bring devastation, and for many, hunger was a familiar companion. Yet despite the hardships, village life was not devoid of community and resilience. Festivals punctuated the year, harvest celebrations, religious feast days, and seasonal fairs provided moments of joy. The church, usually standing near the village, offered not only spiritual guidance but also a place for gathering. Weddings, baptisms, and funerals marked the passage of life, binding the community together. Laughter and music echoed during festivals, where even the poorest might dance, sing, and briefly escape the burdens of labor. The castle relied heavily on this community, but the relationship was double-edged. While lords offered protection, some were exploitative, demanding high rents or imposing harsh justice. Rebellions, though rare, did occur. Discontented peasants occasionally rose up against their lords, especially in times of famine or war. The bonds between castle and village were strong, but they were not unbreakable. Economically, castles also influenced wider trade networks. Positioned along rivers, roads, or trade routes, many lords collected tolls from merchants passing through their lands. Bridges, gates, and even castle roads became opportunities for income. This gave castles a dual role: military strongholds and economic choke points. To control a castle was often to control the wealth of an entire region. Daily interactions between villagers and castle inhabitants were constant. Peasants delivered food to the castle kitchens, provided firewood for its hearths, and mended its equipment. In return, they might receive leftover trenchers from feasts, protection during raids, or permission to gather wood from the lord's forests. These exchanges reinforced the visible and invisible ties binding the community together. From the lord's perspective, the village was his lifeline. A castle without productive peasants was a hollow shell, incapable of sustaining itself. The flow of grain into the granaries, wool into storerooms, and taxes into coffers ensured that the castle could function not just in times of peace but also during the inevitable storms of war. Seen in this light, the castle was not simply a fortress of stone, it was the center of an entire economic ecosystem. Its walls symbolized authority, but its true power radiated outward through the labor of peasants, the hum of markets, and the cycle of fields and farms. Without the surrounding village, the great halls would fall silent, kitchens would go cold, and soldiers would be left unfed. The might of the castle was inseparable from the soil beneath it. As the sun set over the fields and smoke rose from village chimneys, the castle loomed in the distance, a constant reminder of both protection and power. For the peasants, it was both guardian and master. For the lord, it was both treasure chest and stronghold. And together, they formed the intertwined world of medieval life, where survival depended on cooperation, labor, and loyalty. But survival was never guaranteed. In times of peace, this delicate balance held firm. In times of war, however, the castle became more than a landlord, it became the ultimate refuge and battlefield. And that brings us to one of the most dramatic chapters of castle life, the reality of sieges and warfare. For all the routines of daily life, all the feasts and festivals, all the rhythms of labor and faith, there was one reality that loomed over every medieval castle: war. Castles were not merely grand residences or symbols of prestige, they were fortresses built for conflict. And nothing tested a castle, or the people inside it, more than a siege. A siege was a brutal chess match played with human lives, patience, and endurance. Unlike open-field battles, where knights clashed in hours of bloody combat, sieges could last weeks, months, even years. They were wars of attrition, designed to starve defenders into submission, cut off supplies, and slowly grind down morale. For those trapped inside the walls, it was a test of both body and spirit. The preparations for such a crisis began long before an enemy appeared. Every castle was designed with defense in mind. High curtain walls loomed over ditches or moats, their surfaces deliberately smoothed to prevent climbing. Towers projected outward to give defenders clear fields of fire. Gatehouses were fortified with portcullises, murder holes, and heavy wooden doors bound with iron. Even the simplest architectural choices had one purpose: to make every step of an attacker's advance a nightmare. When word spread that an enemy army was approaching, life inside the castle changed instantly. Farmers drove livestock within the walls, carts of grain and barrels of ale were hauled into storerooms, and villagers crowded into cramped chambers. The castle, once a seat of authority, transformed into a crowded refuge. Guards doubled their watch, soldiers strapped on armor, and the lord called upon every oath-bound vassal to stand ready. For defenders, the first weapon was distance. Archers lined the walls, their arrows raining down on advancing troops. Stones were hurled from catapults, and boiling water, or in some cases, quicklime, was poured through murder holes onto attackers below. Crossbowmen, though slower to fire than longbowmen, delivered bolts with terrifying force, capable of piercing armor at close range. Every inch of wall became a stage for deadly defense. For attackers, ingenuity was key. Siege warfare evolved into a contest of technology as much as courage. Battering rams, sheathed in protective wooden tortoises, smashed against gates. Siege towers, taller than the walls themselves, rolled forward on creaking wheels, packed with soldiers ready to storm the battlements. Catapults and trebuchets hurled boulders, dead animals, and even burning pitch over the walls, spreading fire and disease. The most feared tactic of all was mining, digging tunnels beneath the castle foundations, then collapsing them to bring entire walls crashing down. But while weapons clashed outside, the real struggle inside was often hunger. A well-prepared castle could withstand months of siege, but supplies were finite. Grain dwindled, meat spoiled, water grew foul. Nobles dined on dwindling stores while servants survived on thin pottage. When food ran out, desperation set in. Chroniclers tell of defenders reduced to boiling leather, eating dogs and rats, even resorting to cannibalism in the most desperate sieges. The stone walls might hold, but human endurance was fragile. Disease was an even deadlier enemy. With villagers crammed inside, sanitation collapsed. Latrines overflowed, water sources became contaminated, and sickness spread rapidly. Dysentery, fevers, and plague often killed more defenders than enemy weapons. For the trapped population, every cough or fever was a reminder that death lurked not only outside the gates but also within. Psychological warfare was just as ruthless. Attackers catapulted the bodies of dead animals or plague victims over the walls to spread fear and infection. They lit fires at night, drums beating to keep defenders sleepless and demoralized. Defenders, in turn, sometimes displayed the bodies of captured enemies as grim warnings. A siege was not just a contest of weapons but a contest of willpower. Yet castles were built to endure, and some held out magnificently. At times, relief armies arrived, forcing attackers to retreat. At other times, sheer determination carried defenders through months of hardship until the besieging force gave up. Chronicles celebrate such moments as proof of the castle's strength and the lord's honor. But victories were rare; more often, hunger and exhaustion eventually forced surrender. When a castle finally fell, the consequences were brutal. If defenders resisted until the last, attackers often showed no mercy. Massacres of garrisons, looting, and burning of villages were common punishments meant to deter future resistance. Surrender terms, if negotiated early, could spare lives, but humiliation was still inevitable. The castle might be occupied, dismantled, or repurposed as a symbol of the victor's dominance. For those inside, surviving a siege was a life-altering experience. Nobles might lose their lands or be ransomed back after capture. Soldiers bore scars both physical and mental. Peasants returned to ruined homes, scorched fields, and empty storehouses. Siege warfare was not only about walls and weapons, it was about the devastation left behind. Yet, despite their horrors, sieges reinforced the castle's central role in medieval life. They demonstrated why such fortresses were built in the first place, not for comfort, not for beauty, but for survival. A castle under siege became the ultimate test of loyalty, courage, and endurance. It forced every inhabitant, lord, knight, servant, and peasant, to face the grim reality of war together. As Europe evolved, so too did the nature of siege warfare. The arrival of gunpowder in the late Middle Ages changed everything. Cannons, with their thunderous roars and destructive force, rendered high walls increasingly obsolete. No matter how thick or tall the stone, gunpowder artillery could eventually shatter it. The age of castles as impregnable fortresses slowly waned, giving way to new forms of fortification. Still, in their prime, castles were unmatched symbols of both defiance and fear. To stand atop the walls during a siege was to witness the raw struggle of medieval life distilled into its starkest form, survival against overwhelming odds. The castle was not just a home or a court, it was a battlefield in stone. And yet, even in times of peace, the shadow of war never left. Training, drills, and watchfulness defined daily routines because everyone knew that tomorrow could bring the sound of distant drums and the sight of enemy banners on the horizon. A castle was always waiting for its next test. Life inside a medieval castle was not only about survival, labor, or war. These fortresses were also centers of culture, entertainment, and symbolism, microcosms of the society they ruled. Beyond their defensive walls, castles were stages where art, music, spectacle, and ritual all came together to shape medieval identity. To begin, one must understand that every castle was more than stone, it was a symbol. The towering walls and lofty keeps were designed to awe. They broadcast power to friend and foe alike. A castle's silhouette rising above the landscape was as much a political message as it was a defensive structure. It said, "Here is authority. Here is wealth. Here is permanence." Peasants toiling in the fields saw not only a military stronghold but also a constant reminder of the lord's dominance over the land. For visiting nobles, the grandeur of a great hall or the sophistication of a chapel declared prestige and legitimacy. But within those same walls, culture flourished in ways that might surprise us. Medieval entertainment ranged from the humble to the magnificent. On quiet evenings, servants and household members might gather to tell folktales, sing simple ballads, or play board games like Nine Men's Morris or chess. For the noble classes, entertainment was grander. Troubadours and minstrels wandered from court to court, performing songs of chivalry, love, and heroic deeds. Their music echoed through stone halls, carrying tales that blended history and myth. Feasts, too, were spectacles of cultural life. More than just meals, they were opportunities to display wealth and status. Tables groaned under roasted meats, exotic spices, and sweet pastries. Jesters performed tricks and witty banter, acrobats astonished with impossible feats, and musicians filled the air with melodies. Feasts often included elaborate rituals, toasts to kings, recitations of heroic poetry, and displays of rare luxuries. For guests, attending a castle banquet was as much about being impressed as it was about eating. Hunting was another major pastime, especially among the nobility. To hunt boar or deer was not simply sport, it was practice for war, training knights in the arts of pursuit, discipline, and kill. It was also deeply symbolic. Falconry, in particular, became a status marker. To own a falcon was to display wealth and sophistication, for falcons were rare, expensive, and required meticulous training. In tapestries and manuscripts, lords and ladies are often shown with falcons perched proudly on their hands, embodying both nobility and mastery over nature. Tournaments brought entertainment to another level. Though often romanticized, these events were brutal and dangerous. Jousting, where armored knights charged at each other with lances, was the centerpiece spectacle. Crowds roared as warriors clashed, banners flew, and heralds announced noble lineages. Beyond combat, tournaments were also highly theatrical, filled with pageantry, music, and ritual. Victors gained honor, wealth, and admiration, while the defeated were sometimes left broken on the field. These tournaments reinforced ideals of chivalry, courage, and competition, the very values that underpinned medieval aristocracy. Religion, too, wove itself into the cultural fabric of castles. Chapels inside the walls hosted daily prayers, marriages, baptisms, and masses. Religious festivals brought moments of joy and solemnity alike. On holy days, even the grim battlements of a fortress might be decorated with banners and garlands, transforming cold stone into spaces of celebration. Christianity infused not only worship but also art. Stained glass windows, illuminated manuscripts, and carved statues inside castles reflected both devotion and artistry, reminding inhabitants of divine presence even in a fortress of war. Symbolism extended beyond art and architecture into rituals of power. The act of hosting guests, distributing gifts, or holding court were themselves forms of cultural performance. A lord seated in the high chair of a great hall, dispensing justice beneath the carved beams and tapestries of his ancestors, was not only ruling, he was embodying authority. Every gesture, every display of luxury, reinforced hierarchy. The castle was theater, and everyone within it played a role. Even leisure carried layers of meaning. Board games like chess were not mere diversions but metaphors for life and war. The movements of pawns and kings mirrored the structure of feudal society itself, teaching strategy and hierarchy. Storytelling, whether through minstrels or wandering poets, was not only entertainment but also education, instilling values of loyalty, honor, and bravery into every listener. For the lower classes living within the walls, cultural life was simpler but no less important. Folk songs carried local history, dances provided rare joy, and seasonal festivals gave rhythm to lives otherwise marked by labor. Though they lacked the luxury of noble feasts or tournaments, they too participated in the cultural heartbeat of the castle. For them, the castle was both prison and protector, oppressor and provider. Even their simplest forms of entertainment were tinged with that duality. As time passed, castles also became repositories of art and memory. Lords commissioned tapestries depicting great battles, genealogies, and biblical stories. These decorated walls served not only to warm drafty chambers but to remind all who entered of lineage and legacy. Castles were not static stone, they were living galleries of history and symbolism. In the end, culture and entertainment inside castles were never frivolous. They were tools of cohesion, distraction, and power. They reinforced hierarchy, provided relief from hardship, and gave meaning to existence within those thick walls. Every song, every feast, every ritual was a reminder, life in a medieval castle was not only about endurance, but also about identity. When we think of castles today, we often picture their cold stones, their moats, and their looming towers. Yet, for those who lived inside, they were also places of music, laughter, rivalry, and faith. They were theaters of medieval life, where survival and spectacle walked hand in hand. For centuries, castles had stood as the ultimate symbols of strength, wealth, and authority. Their towers loomed over villages, their walls cast shadows across valleys, and their battlements defined medieval warfare. But nothing lasts forever. By the late Middle Ages, the age of castles was drawing to a close. The very structures that had once seemed invincible were rendered vulnerable by new inventions, shifting politics, and changing societies. The decline of castles was not sudden but gradual, a fading of relevance as the medieval world itself gave way to something new. The first and most decisive factor in this decline was technology, specifically, gunpowder. Arriving in Europe during the 13th and 14th centuries, it revolutionized warfare. Cannons, crude at first, quickly grew more powerful. By the 15th century, artillery could reduce stone walls to rubble in days, where once sieges had taken months or even years. No matter how thick the masonry, the thunderous force of cannonballs tore through defenses that had stood for generations. High curtain walls and tall towers, once symbols of strength, became liabilities, easy targets for explosive firepower. Castles tried to adapt. Some were reinforced with angled bastions, lower and thicker walls designed to deflect cannon fire. Moats were widened, gatehouses fortified. Yet these adaptations were costly, and even they struggled to match the growing sophistication of artillery. The design of fortresses shifted into a new style, star-shaped bastions, spread across wide areas, with low walls and sloping earthworks. These were not castles in the traditional sense but a new form of military architecture better suited for the gunpowder age. The second factor in the decline of castles was political centralization. In the early Middle Ages, castles were essential tools for lords and barons to assert dominance over their territories. They were strongholds of feudal power, enabling local rulers to resist or rebel against kings. But as monarchies grew stronger, this decentralized model of power weakened. Kings and centralized states no longer wanted private fortresses dotting the countryside. Some rulers even ordered the destruction, or slighting, of castles to prevent rebellious lords from using them as bases of resistance. England's monarchs, for example, after quelling revolts, often dismantled the castles of defeated nobles as both punishment and deterrent. The changing role of warfare also diminished the castle's importance. By the late medieval and early modern periods, battles were increasingly fought in open fields with large professional armies, rather than in prolonged sieges. Castles, once vital military hubs, were bypassed or ignored in favor of decisive campaigns. The resources needed to maintain a garrison and fortify a castle became harder to justify when warfare itself was shifting toward mobility and massed firepower. Economic changes accelerated the decline. The medieval economy had been agrarian, rooted in feudal dues and obligations. Castles fit perfectly into that world, as centers of both authority and protection. But as trade expanded, cities grew, and wealth shifted into mercantile hands, castles became less central. Merchants and burghers looked not to fortified towers but to town walls, guild halls, and marketplaces for protection and influence. Power was no longer measured solely in stone fortresses but in gold, trade routes, and fleets of ships. At the same time, culture itself was changing. The Renaissance brought new tastes, new art, and new expectations of comfort. Stone chambers, draughty halls, and dimly lit keeps were no longer enough for Europe's elites. Nobles and monarchs desired palaces, not fortresses. Architecture shifted toward elegance and display rather than pure defense. Windows grew larger, gardens more elaborate, interiors more richly decorated. Where castles had once embodied a fusion of war and domesticity, Renaissance palaces embodied luxury, prestige, and a new definition of power. For many castles, this meant a new lease on life, not as fortresses, but as residences or administrative centers. Some were transformed into stately homes, their defenses softened, their walls pierced with wide windows, their great halls turned into ballrooms. Others fell into ruin, abandoned when their military purpose vanished and their upkeep became too burdensome. Across Europe, once mighty strongholds were left to crumble, their stones quarried for local building projects, their moats filled in, their towers collapsing into ivy-covered relics. Yet even in decline, castles did not lose their symbolic weight. If anything, their ruins acquired new meanings. In the Romantic era of the 18th and 19th centuries, poets, painters, and travelers rediscovered them as haunting reminders of a vanished age. The crumbling walls and shattered towers stirred imaginations, evoking tales of knights, damsels, and heroic struggles. Artists like Caspar David Friedrich painted castles as ghostly silhouettes, symbols of nostalgia and mystery. What had once been engines of war became monuments of memory. In some regions, castles endured not through nostalgia but adaptation. Many were converted into administrative seats, prisons, or even tourist attractions. Others became heritage sites, meticulously preserved to showcase the medieval past. Kings and aristocrats, too, sometimes embraced castle imagery to reinforce their own claims to tradition. For example, the 19th century saw a revival of neo-Gothic architecture, with new castles built not for defense but for display, echoing the shapes and towers of the medieval past while hiding modern luxuries inside. But for the people of the Middle Ages who once crowded into these fortresses during times of siege or famine, the castle's decline was bittersweet. The end of castles meant the end of a way of life. The rhythms of feudal loyalty, the constant specter of siege, the harsh hierarchies of stone, all gave way to a different world. In their place rose cities, courts, and states that defined the modern era. Castles had been more than just buildings, they were the physical embodiment of medieval society. Their fall mirrored the end of that age itself. Today, when we walk among castle ruins or marvel at restored fortresses, we are not seeing just architecture. We are glimpsing the skeletons of an entire civilization. Their decline was inevitable, but their legacy endures. They remind us that even the mightiest symbols of human power are temporary. Stone crumbles, towers fall, and walls collapse, but the stories they carried live on. The fall of castles was not a tragedy, but a transformation. They did not vanish from memory, instead, they passed from practical necessity into myth, legend, and history. Once the backbone of medieval life, castles became echoes of the past, shaping how we imagine the Middle Ages even centuries after their military relevance had ended.